Okay, so the next thing we have is a panel discussion. The Sustainable Development Goals are global goals for each and every country to aspire to. Often when we think about inequality or poverty, our mind focuses on countries overseas. However, within Australia, we still have challenges. Health and employment outcomes for our Indigenous population lag significantly behind the rest of the population. And with respect to health and well-being, we now have significant problems with obesity and alcohol-related violence, which is often in the media and has very negative connotations for our communities. So this panel will discuss what we need to do at home to achieve these global goals. And please join me in welcoming our panel. We have Brendan Ferguson. Please come out to the stage, Brendan, and take a seat on the couch. Phil Lockyer, Head of Indigenous Engagement at IAG, Leah Armstrong, Chairperson Supply Nation, and Chris Raine, Founder and CEO of Hello Sunday Morning. Please welcome the panel. And I should say Brendan Ferguson, Social Ventures Australia. Thank you for joining me on the couch. Well, I'm not on the couch, I'm on the chair. But look, Chris, let me start with you. You took a really interesting stand against, alcohol, which is, I guess, a very Australian thing. To not take a stand is not a very Australian thing, but alcohol is a very Australian thing. Why did you do that? It would have been a big challenge, particularly for a young male Aussie.
So my background originally was in nightclub promotion. So in my,
Okay.
so I was standing on the other side. Now I'm standing. I don't know where I'm standing anymore. So when in my early 20s, I spent my time and energy trying to get people to drink more, and learned a lot, and that's sort of where this whole thing began, because it's kind of the way we use drugs in society, including alcohol, I've always found quite fascinating, and it's quite an easy business model to get people to use more drugs, but it's often not the healthier path to take. So for me personally, and that was a big part of my life, and Hello Sunday Morning began as a personal experience where I took a year off drinking just to see what life is like and see, where alcohol could play a role.
Was there a moment that made you go, I've got to stop, I've got to do this? Was there a moment, an episode that happened that prompted you to do that?
Yeah, people from media love that, like,
I am a journalist, it's my job.
To be honest, I don't have a pinpoint moment. I don't have an epiphanic experience that was like, this is why I'm doing it. I certainly did a lot of things. I was arrested, lost my license. Like, a lot of things came along the way, but it wasn't the reason why I wanted to go on this experience in this path. For me, it's about opportunity and being quite ambitious as a young person, just being hungover week in, week out, questioning how I was using alcohol and thinking, okay, maybe there's a better path. Mm-hmm. And then realising from a career perspective that actually there's a lot of people out there that wake up with that revelation, yet the services are not there to help them, other than things that have been developed in the 1930s and haven't improved since then. So that's what Hello Sunday Morning is about. It's about building really great experiences for people that want to change that part of their life.
Did you expect that it would actually become such a huge global movement that it has?
So 3 months into my year, my roommate, so I was blogging and my roommate's like, I want to do it too. I'm like, go away, man, this is my thing. Like, I'm going to do this and then I'm going to go back to my life. But he managed to convince me that this is like, it would be better if more people did it. So I'm very selfish. But luckily, because now there's 60,000 people around the world that are doing it, and that is, and that's a real global ambition for us to make it about as many people as possible. So it wasn't in the beginning, but it definitely is now.
And Phil Lockyer, you're at the head of Indigenous Engagement at IAG. So yep. IAG is a very large business. What are the challenges that you face, I guess, implementing what your role and what you want to do within a large organisation like that, and how does that sort of work with the sustainable development goals?
I think given we're an insurance company and a lot of corporates are engaged in kind of a reconciliation process, Indigenous initiatives. But I think for me it's important that we do things that relate to our business. So we're about obviously building resilience in communities, and when there's a natural disaster or someone's had an accident, how do we help support them and how do we help support communities? So I guess for me is being able to, there's so much we could be doing, there are so many great Indigenous programs we could be funding, so how do we narrow that down to the things that are important for us? A lot of Indigenous communities, a lot of remote ones live in areas where there are a lot of natural disasters, so how do they rebuild their homes and how do they rebuild their communities after that, because the government's not going to do it. There's a lot of attention a few months after a natural disaster, but the long term. But also how do we work with Indigenous communities to be more resilient? And that's not to resilience to natural perils, but to resilience around crime, education. How do we build more resilient Indigenous communities? Because I think if Aboriginal people, especially young people, are more resilient, then we're going to have better education outcomes, we're going to have better health outcomes. So.
And Professor Greg Whitwell, he was talking about shared responsibility in business. Now, obviously, how do you, because I would imagine you would face a lot of that sort of challenge, balancing, the business side and also the social good side of what your business is trying to achieve and trying to do. So how do you actually do that? How do you prosecute that case, I guess?
From a shared value perspective, if more Aboriginal young people finish school, go to university, have better jobs, they can afford insurance and buy it off us, hopefully. I think we have to look at Indigenous people and communities as potential customers. I think when, a lot of research suggests that if Indigenous people had the same life expectancy, had the same education level, there would be, I think, $4 billion more in tax for Treasury. So I think, when Indigenous people are at the same level economically as non-Indigenous people, then they're going to have a whole range of choices economically they can make. And as an insurance company, everyone needs insurance, as unsexy as that might be, and Indigenous people are very underinsured. So the business case, medium and long term for us, is there's potential customers we're going to get out of that. And I think a lot of people think, as a corporate, when you're thinking, well, shouldn't you just be giving money because that feels good, or you should be doing this because you're a good corporate citizen. If you don't attach a business outcome to it, and if it's not aligned to what your business is, then the programs that you do will disappear after a couple of years.
And I guess, Leah, I saw you sort of nodding as well in agreement with Phil. These problems of alcohol-related violence and lack of education, they affect many members of our communities, Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. It's it's related to socioeconomic status. I guess in terms of your view, what do you see as the biggest challenges, and how do you see, solutions working in that context to kind of overcome these problems?
Well, that's there's no one solution that's going to solve all that.
It's a simple question, isn't it?
And very, and the issues we all face, and in particular First Australians and Indigenous, are very complex. But just picking up on, Phil's comments in terms of shared value and sort of, the business case, and I will draw on Reconciliation Australia, so my previous role as CEO of Reconciliation Australia. Many of you may have heard of the Reconciliation Action Plan program, which actually turns good intentions into real practical actions, and it calls on major corporations, schools, government to put together these reconciliation action plans, which is what Phil's company, IAG, has done, is developed a reconciliation action plan. And it's about building respectful relationships. That's the start, the cornerstone of is actually building respectful relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and engage with them and include them in the discussion. And then it's actually, well, what are the opportunities? How can we create opportunities? And our discussion, Brendan and I talked about, opportunities, creating market opportunities, creating employment opportunities. What are the opportunities that a health company like Bupa can do in terms of helping address issues around smoking or, alcohol, or, and even though, we have companies that people might say, well, like, should I say Crown, where gambling is an issue. But how can we, also work with them to sort of put in place educational programs around gambling, or, some of the other sort of areas that we couldn't think, well, that they are detrimental to our society. I will point out Adam Mooney, who's in the audience as well, and Adam worked with Reconciliation Australia during the development of the Reconciliation Action Plans, and we have up to now, Adam, about 1,000 companies and organisations with reconciliation action plans across Australia. And this is not just about doing things for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This is doing things with First Australians. And what we're seeing in these companies is actually that change of culture in the companies that benefits not just First Australians who come into it, but actually all cultures. So that's the type of change we're seeing across Australia.
Okay. And you touched on something really interesting, and Brendan, I'm going to go to you on this, even though Leah touched on it, was governments also. And you know, I guess it's very important that we have leadership from governments. Now, our former Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, made much of a big deal about the fact that he spent specific amounts of time each year of his short tenureship with Indigenous communities. I say that with no subtext. Was that effective? And is that the type of thing that you want to see our now Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull engage in, or are there other things that governments can do to show leadership on this front?
I think the question of government engagement with communities is a bit of a vexed question. I mean, Leah sits on the Prime Minister's Advisory Council. That's one mechanism through which government uses to engage with First Australians. Equally, that body has been criticised, I don't think Leah would mind me saying, for being unrepresentative. Then we also have the Congress. Now that's been defunded. So you sort of say, well, what purpose does that serve? And then there's also separate proposals that haven't necessarily got mainstream support around setting up an assembly of First Nations, which might include representatives from each of the prescribed body corporates that are set up to manage native title interests, for instance. So there are different mechanisms that we could use. I think what everyone would agree with is that we haven't got the engagement right, and that government needs to continue to find ways to better engage. And then I suppose once you've got the engagement piece, then we'd look at the $30 billion that's spent on services for First Australians, and specifically on the $5.6 billion that is spent on First Australian specific government services. And I guess I'd question what percentage of that is actually tied to the achievement of social outcomes. So do we know whether that money is actually achieving the outcomes that we want to achieve? And at the moment, I'd say we certainly don't, and we need to get better at that.
So what you're saying is we need better tracking of where funding is going and what sort of impact it's having.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, you could sort of look at three things. We touched on the governance piece. We touched on the measurement and evaluation piece, but then also there's the empowerment of communities to understand and make decisions about what services they need in that community and how they can achieve the outcomes they're trying to achieve for their communities.
And I think it's really interesting too, and Leah, you know, with your experience, in terms of tackling these issues, is it a generational thing? You know, it tends to be older generations telling younger generations, you know, what should or shouldn't be done, or, you know, trying to listen to them. But do younger people need to be brought in and engaged more with, in these formal situations that then can go out to the community and sort of try to change things?
It absolutely is a generational thing that we need. Change won't happen overnight. Change won't happen within a 3-year parliamentary time frame. Change won't happen within a corporate entity's business planning cycle. We have to think about this in 30, 40-year generational change. You know, personally, I've had, you know, the leaders ahead of me who have sort of paved the way in terms of land rights, in terms of all that, and certainly, you know, their role, and they're very strong about that, is important. You know, my generation is sort of picking up that from education and that, and behind us there is an amazing group of young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are coming through, that have gone to university, that are working in corporate companies. And, you know, when we put them up onto the stage, they are inspiring, and that's what actually keeps me going, and it keeps, I know, a lot of our leaders going when they see these younger Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people coming through. The thing is that we want to do is that in the past, we've always seen that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people would go into government or would go into community services. We're actually seeing a lot of them now wanting to go into corporate and corporate are actually saying, I mean, the business benefit for corporates is they're getting these amazing young, educated Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are coming into their companies and sharing innovative ideas and different things. So actually, there's a group called Career Trackers, which does internships. Phil's company probably uses them as well for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, university students. They're signing up major companies for 10-year agreements to take university students at the moment, and they can't get enough of them, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and they're pretty inspiring. So, you know, it is going to take generations, but these, I think, as I talked about earlier, these young people are always saying, you know, this is about giving back as well. So they're wanting to bring people along with them.
And
Can
go
I
ahead.
just
Yeah,
add
absolutely.
to that? Career Trackers is one of the ventures that Social Ventures support. So would add to Leah's comments about the impact that they're having. And another organisation that we also support, Gambina, our colleague Adrian Appo set that organisation up, and it's based in Shepparton, which has a large First Australian community in Victoria. And they have a 2-generational strategic plan, and that is to lift, you know, an entire generation or 2 generations of First Australians up to, you know, the same outcomes as the mainstream through supporting them all through the education process and into transitions into an employment.
Yeah, and that's because I was going to ask you, Phil, in terms of one of the problems that I've sort of been aware of or heard of, particularly through the media, is in some remote communities, it's about the resourcing and making sure that these people aren't necessarily cut off because of where they live. So I guess the question is, how do we bridge the gap for those people and make sure that they're included, and what sort of role can, you know, big business play in that alongside, you know, government support? Because we know that we can't rely on governments entirely. We have to also take responsibility and play a role in that as well.
Yeah, I mean, we can't really rely on government, I think, to help solve a lot of the challenges in Indigenous communities. I think for me, one of the real problems is, you know, we've got billions and billions of dollars being spent. So it's not the money, it's who controls how that money is being spent. We support an organisation called VMPY Women's Council in the communities outside of Alice Springs, and, you know, they do a lot of great work supporting, you know, Aboriginal women in really tough circumstances. And we say to them, we're going to give you this amount of money and you do whatever you want with it. And they were quite shocked at the idea of they don't have to report that 3 times a year, and, you know, we tell them that you know best. I think that if we actually gave more the control and the decision making to Indigenous communities, especially in remote communities, around how they should spend the money that is in the pot, then I think that money would be more efficiently spent and would be more effective. Obviously, there's only so many jobs and opportunities you can have in a remote community. So if certain people want certain opportunities, like anyone, you might have to leave. But I think we can do better around health and education if we actually allow a lot of these Indigenous communities in those locations to actually deliver the money and to actually make the opportunities and the plans themselves, instead of being dictated to by bureaucrats in Canberra.
And just on that, the prescriptive sort of ideas of, here's your card, but you can only use it for a certain amount of things, no alcohol, no tobacco, etc. I mean, that, you know, I'd be interested in all of your views on that. But Phil?
Look, I'm not sure about that card. I think if the community want it, and if they actually think that there's value in their community having it, then I think that's fine. But I think when you prescriptively decide, we're going to give you this card and you're only going to spend it with A, B and C, then I think you take away the decision-making and the empowerment opportunity for anybody, whether it's Indigenous people or not.
Leah?
Yeah, I mean, I think I guess the key to it is where it's actually being, you know, driven by the community from the ground up, rather being an imposed intervention on communities that, as we've, you know, seen, that actually, as Phil says, disempowers them. So then they're actually, you know, trapped into sort of always looking to government, always looking to whoever imposed that intervention to fix my ills, rather than, you know, coming from the ground up. So certainly, we're a community, and I don't dispute if a community does say we want this in our community and we will actually, monitor and manage it, and we want to actually have a real say in how it's rolled out, being at the decision table and have control of it, then, I accept their decision.
And I guess, Chris, that's what you did, because it's a grassroots up program that you took control of something that you wanted to take control of in your life, and then that sort of spread throughout your immediate community and then beyond. It wasn't a top-down government sort of thing, which is quite interesting.
Well, I can sort of pick up the thread of conversation. I think I love Social Ventures Australia's mission around outcomes and having agreed set of like the development goals, like this is what we want to achieve as a country, these are the outcomes in health, these are the outcomes in education, and let's set those goals visibly and shareably, if that's a word.
It is now.
It is now. Thank you. Hashtag me. Then it's a matter of incentives of community organisations using the resources to achieve those goals. So as a not-for-profit in the corporate structure that we changed, the perennial problem that we have is we have to go and get funding, and the only way we get the funding is we are like 12 months from now, we will build this feature, and then we'll do that feature, and then we'll do this campaign and that campaign, and then 6 months into it, we've successfully executed all our features, but we have to do this other stuff that we wouldn't do, but we've made this agreement in the contract in the beginning. It should be on outcomes. It should be how many people did you help, how much did you reduce their consumption of alcohol or change their mental health. And I think a system with greater data infrastructure can do that from a government perspective and on a local level. So you have government setting these objectives with industry, and as corporates become more engaged in it and are more incentivised to have these outcomes as well as community groups agreeing to those goals with a financial and emotional outcome attached to those achievements. So I think that's a direction that we're going. We haven't quite got the plumbing there yet, and particularly from a not-for-profit organisation, I think the model is a little staid, and then these models are starting to come out with B Corps and public benefit corporations and things like that, where young entrepreneurs are more interested in it when there is reward for the risks that they're taking. So I think as this infrastructure is being built, there will be young Indigenous people too wanting to go back into their communities and actually doing good work and being rewarded for it, rather than having to go and work in a corporate and not do the thing that they perhaps want to do.
Yeah. Brendan, I want to take a comment from you, but I just want to, before we do that, we're getting to time for Q&A. So I encourage anyone who has a question to please come down and line up at the mics, and then Brendan, we'll go to you.
Sure. Thanks, Whitney. And again, to pick up on some of the themes, the remote communities question, alignment with community interests and social outcomes. We've done a lot of government bashing. It's fun. It's easy. I'll give them a free kick. One program that
They make it easy, by the way.
Indeed. One program that has worked and that we should celebrate and we should continue to fund, grow the funding of and leverage it is the Working on Country program. It funds 730 full-time equivalent Indigenous rangers to look after their country, usually in a way that is consistent with an Indigenous protected area plan of management that they've been funded to develop. We've worked closely with a few organisations, but in particular Kanyin Pachukupa in the Western Desert, or KJ. And KJ employs, in the last financial year, 260 Maru people to work on country in 3 communities that total about 800 people. Now, there is nothing else in that community in the way of employment opportunities. And what is great about the Working on Country program is they've found an alignment between what the mainstream, in this case government, is willing to pay for and what First Australians want to do. And now what we're seeing is a number of these groups that have Working on Country programs, or IPAs, are starting to leverage that funding which allows rangers to be out on country to also take advantage of commercial opportunities. So whether that be working with research organisations, resources companies in land management and rehabilitation, pastoralists who are out on the land as well. And so they're starting to get to the point where they can actually build up a more sustainable funding base to sit alongside that base investment that government has provided. So I guess one example of where it has worked, it's not necessarily going to be a fix for all communities, particularly when we move away from the remote communities and look at the eastern seaboard where connection to country is a different prospect. But I think it's important to try and identify the things that are working, and this is one that has. And we're seeing not just employment outcomes or environmental outcomes, but through that participation, you actually start to achieve some of the other social and cultural outcomes. And, you know, if you ask me how to reduce alcohol and substance abuse in remote communities, I'd say through the Ranger program, not through a alcohol awareness program, for instance.
Okay, thank you, Brendan.
Hey, I'm Eddie, and I want to ask Chris a question, because sometimes I find it hard not to drink when you're going out. And last night I tried, I didn't drink, and everyone around me was drinking. And sometimes I feel it's more about willpower. And I'm just wondering, what do you feel, or what have you seen are the biggest factors for someone to change a habit like that? So to stop drinking and to continue that habit?
Well, I commend you for giving it a crack last night. I mean, that's what it's all about. Experimentation, trying things, seeing if you like them, and I think there's nothing that I could say that you would then go forth and live by. It's really your own experience that's important.
Yeah.
So.
But I've seen, like, I just like browsing your website, and it seems like you build up like a network of people to support each other. And I think that's one way to help you. Like, if you're around people who don't drink, you're more likely not to, right?
You should come work at our marketing team, man.
I should check it out.
You want a job? You got it.
Why not? Why not?
I think what you should be saying is selling what you do. So what's around any level of addiction, right? And I say addiction in a way that we are all addictive people. Like, that is human nature. And we have different levels of addictions to different things. And alcohol is a very common one because it's legal, 90% of us drink it, and there's these cultural stories around it. So we will always face these challenges. Now, what's some really fascinating research that's coming out is around the fact that if you become highly addicted to a substance, often what's missing is a sense of love and connection to people around you. So for us, the core of what we do is facilitating connection between people that are going through the same experience at the same time. And that's what is built, built Alcoholics Anonymous, and why it's successful. Where Alcoholics Anonymous isn't successful is it's attached to a certain model around what you need to do. So I don't think that should ever be, you should ever say, you need to do X, Y, Z. I think that's a personal journey. And I think you should have, exactly right, the tools to find that. So connection and tools, and they're the main things. So yeah, sign up to the website.
Yeah.
Buy those tools.
It's right there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
My name's Grant Young. I just had a question that kind of was sparked by Leah's comments earlier. I've just recently finished working with the National Centre of Indigenous Excellence, working with the Indigenous Digital Excellence Program. And one of the things that I recognised in that is that a vast majority of the enterprises that we were seeing, as was represented in Vanita's program, were linked to cultural values and linked to benefit for community and with community. And yet a lot of the business tools are around profit. So we've got that tension again. Thinking about the development goals, obviously that's what we're aiming for, and I just think that there's a huge amount that could be learnt from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander enterprise in that. But just wondering what the role of B Corps would play, whether Supply Nation is looking at that aspect of things, and I'm aware that Indigenous Business Australia is doing. Just your thoughts on B Corps as a model and Indigenous business as a model that we can learn from to achieve those goals more broadly.
Look, certainly the B Corp model, I would sort of say we've actually got something very similar happening in a way with the RAPs, the Reconciliation Action Plans, because they measure outcomes against those actions and the reporting back to Reconciliation Australia on, achieving of those actions. Supply Nation, just to give you everybody in the audience a bit of a sort of snapshot about who we are. We're a national body that connects government and corporates to Indigenous businesses, particularly through their supply chain, so that there's that market opportunities and options there. And we certify and register Indigenous businesses, and certainly we have a criteria around what constitutes an Indigenous business, so that there is, I guess, a level of comfort from government and corporate that they are definitely procuring services and products from an Indigenous business. And that criteria is, if I can just sort of quickly say, is that the shareholdership or the ownership structure is 51% owned by an Indigenous family, individual, company. They actually have in the management and certainly the CEO is an Indigenous person, and that they're actually part of the decision making and control of that business. That model has been taken, I guess, from the 40-odd years that the minority groups in the United States, the African Americans and the Hispanics and the First Nations, have been doing through their minority development councils in the US, and that has driven the growth of close to $40 billion of actual business with minority groups in the US. So we adopted that model here in Australia, and that's what we're aiming to sort of bring that. And I know your arguments around we're always looking at the profit side, but I mean again I think I have to say Benita's comments in terms of that response that it's the decision making in the communities that determines, and that's the important thing that needs to be valued. That's up to communities to decide how they measure through profit or for community or through cultural aspects. So anyway, and getting back to your point, is there a model for using B Corp or I think the RAPs are doing similar things in that way. Certainly Supply Nation are looking at ways that we can, I guess, look at a model of auditing companies to ensure that they actually are achieving those outcomes in terms of procurement. And that all sort of, working closely with Reconciliation Australia, who run the RAP program, and Indigenous Business Australia as well. So,
Thank you, Leah. And Chris?
Yeah. So, charities are dead. Sorry, that was my Donald Trump.
Okay, there's the headline. There's the headline for the day, folks. Charities are dead, according to Chris Raine. Tweet it out.
And so is traditional corporates. I think the future organisation will need to do both. You will need to, and your marketing will be the social outcomes that you're doing. So as we move into this world, and it's an exciting new world, because both those things need to happen. Even as a not-for-profit, you have to generate revenue. And rather than doing some gala ball, for us, imagine us and doing a gala ball, you pay, $1,000 and everyone gets shit-faced. But that's the business model, and it's dumb. It's dumb for a charity to do that. You should, as a charity, your incentives should be aligned on the work you are doing. You shouldn't have to separate your attention. So for me, the future of all organisations is a B Corp or a reconciliation plan or whatever that infrastructure is, and all organisations will need to fit under that model. It's quite a nascent area, and I think it's an exciting area, but both these organisations are moving towards the centre, which is sustainable development goals. Okay.
Did you have a comment, Brendan? Did you?
Sure.
Sorry, I wasn't. Sorry.
No, I think this discussion is obviously quite central, or not obviously, but it is quite central to what we at Social Ventures try and do. We have an impact investing team. They are a bunch of ex-bankers facilitating social finance deals, and what they're looking for is something that generates both a financial and a social return. And people who've been working through what the impact investing landscape looks like over time have often talked about social first and finance first investors. Now, that sort of binary distinction is perhaps a little bit unhelpful, but I think in Chris's new world, where there are no corporates and there are no charities, and actually every organisation is a for-purpose organisation, and that purpose may be maybe more central than the profit-making or revenue-generating function, or equally it might be the other way around for corporates, for instance. But I think the support for social enterprise and the development of the social enterprise sector, coupled with the sort of shared value movement, pushes both sides of the spectrum into the middle, and that's sort of, I think, what Chris is describing.
And a question here?
All right. Hi, my name is Sophia. First of all, just want to say you guys all do awesome work. I'm a big fan of social entrepreneurship, so you guys are awesome. My question is about Indigenous education. So there's been a lot of talk of education being the way to improve the first Australian situation at the moment. And of course, I'm a big fan of education as a way of empowering a population. But it does depend on what is being taught and the attitude of the teachers towards their students. So my question is, to what extent, if all schools... sorry, can you hear my voice shaking a bit? Sorry, I'm a bit nervous. To what extent, if all schools teach primarily Western ideology, is this more assimilation than empowerment? And linked to that is, how can we make this a two-way education, especially in the face of looking for a more sustainable way of life by 2030?
Okay, and who is that to? Should we go with Phil or Leah or...?
Anyone who wants to answer, whoever's got the first thought.
Yeah. Look, I will just agree with you in terms of one of the areas that we had been focused on was the curriculum, the national curriculum. When I say we, in Reconciliation Australia, when I was there. And at, a few years ago, there was, the cross-curriculum priorities for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, histories to be taught across curriculum. Unfortunately, that's now all been changed and wound back. So, it is disappointing that it is. But what we had focused on is absolutely we need for reconciliation to be a reality, to focus on young people, even right back into the preschool area. And so how do we get schools and childcare centres engaged in reconciliation and respecting and valuing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, histories back into that area. And we have established a program, it's just like a wrap program for schools and primary schools. So notwithstanding the changes that are happening in the national curriculum, I think the more we can get families and parents and school kids involved in understanding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and histories, I think, we have to do that regardless of what the curriculum. But it also comes back to actually what is being taught in universities for teacher quality as well. I think that the change needs to happen there as well.
Look, I'm not an educator. I think what you've said is completely correct. There's an organisation we support called AIM, the Australian Indigenous Mentor Experience. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. It actually began at this university about 10 years ago. So it has Aboriginal kids in year 9 to 12 being mentored and supported by university students who are generally non-Indigenous. And they do a program 1 day a week whereby the kids from, Tempe, Glebe, Redfern come onto Sydney University and do, an hour-long or 2-hour-long program around building confidence and building resilience. I think a lot of reasons why Indigenous kids drop out of school is not because they can't do the work. I think they don't necessarily have the confidence and the self-esteem, potentially because of things that are going on in the home, but also potentially things that are going on in the classroom. And so programs like AIM help to build that confidence and self-esteem and value, because their whole kind of mantra is telling these kids, you're going to be school captain in year 12, you're going to university. So it kind of places in a mindset for them a whole different paradigm of thinking that you're Indigenous, you are going to be successful, and that's it. And so I think programs like AIM, which is a national program, are ways in which we can help kids become more successful in schooling. There's a whole range of institutional problems with the education system, which I couldn't comment about, but I think need to be addressed as well. But I think the things that we can do also outside the classroom are going to help that.
Thank you for your question. And before we wrap for a break, if you have questions that have been missed that you haven't had an opportunity to ask during the session, I encourage you to find the panel during the break and ask them directly. But before we wrap for the break, I'm just going to go down the line. I want a headline from each of you. What kind of world do you want to live in by 2030? Chris, go.
I go last, please.
Okay. Brendan, go. What kind of world... What kind of world do you want to live in by 2030? Just one thing.
I can. So where decisions are controlled more by local communities than by federal governments.
Okay, Brendan?
Where
Okay. Leah?
For me, it's where differences are valued and respected.
where mainstream hello, where mainstream Australia recognises and celebrates First Australian culture.
Chris?
The personal passion of mine and why I'd love to see this by 2030 is that no matter what addiction you have to any drug, that you get immediate and effective and non-judgmental support accessible to your phone where you're at, no matter where you are in the world. That would be a very different world to the one we have, and one that I would love to see.
Great. And with that, please join me in thanking the panel.